Go ahead. Hi, welcome to Composting 101. This is our fourth workshop in our webinar series, and we will be just doing a brief overview on composting, what it is, different methods, and also about how to implement one or two specific methods at your school. So let's get started. I'm Crystal, by the way, and I'm an intern at Healthy Planet US. Arian and Liza will be moderating, so feel free to ask any questions just in the chat box, and someone will get right to you. Okay, so for this workshop, we'll be going over, again, what is composting, why is it important, certain composting basics that apply to all different systems. Then we'll be looking at three of the main, most well-used systems, hot active composting, cold passive composting, and vermicomposting. I'll also be explaining a bit about the ratio of browns and greens, that particular concept, as well as looking at how to use cold passive compost system, and doing a brief intro to vermicomposting as well. Okay, so let's get started. What is composting? Composting is the process of breaking down decaying organic matter into compost, and compost is the nutrient-rich soil that results from the process. Composting is basically how nature recycles. It is how you return nutrients into the soil, and it continues the whole plant life cycle. Backyard composting specifically are various systems and techniques that we can use to accelerate the natural composting process. So why is composting important, and why is this something that we want to encourage amongst our schools and our students? Well, there's various reasons. First of all, it's because it saves money by lowering garbage bills and replacing store-bought fertilizer. This also results in a decreased need for chemical fertilizers and pesticides, which is just a much lower environmental impact as well. This also improves soil fertility and health. It usually results in a much more bountiful harvest, and also promotes overall better air quality, and it does this by limiting the amount of organic material that goes into landfills, which as a result of breaking down without oxygen, these organic materials, since they're trapped in garbage bags and underneath all this other garbage, it creates a large percentage of methane emissions in North America. Even though methane is a lot less prevalent than CO2, is about 20 times more potent. So the whole act of composting is one of the main things as well, is that it promotes much better air quality and limits air pollution. Composting is also very important as a balanced, slow-release source of nutrients, that it won't overwhelm your plants and will help the soil hold on to nutrients for long enough for the plants to use them. And because if you use commercial fertilizers, a common problem is just simply completely overwhelming them with nutrients. Another reason is just simply that composting is an incredibly valuable teaching tool. This is something that will help provide you a method of teaching your kids not only about nature, but also about the whole life cycle from the seed all the way to harvesting, and then to its death and compost, and how we can use compost to bring more life into the garden as well. And last of all, composting diverts waste from landfills, waterways, and water treatment centers, which is a major environmental problem. Okay, so composting basics. Composting, it requires three basic ingredients. We have browns, greens, and water. Browns are the carbon-rich materials such as dead leaves, branches, twigs. Greens are the organic materials that are nitrogen rich. So these are things that such as like grass clippings, vegetable waste, fruit scraps, coffee grounds. Any compost piles requires both of these different kinds of organic materials. You need a particular mix of them. You can't just have one or the other. And then the last most very important ingredient to compost is water. And one of the main problems that we've noticed with a lot of compost pile is just not having enough water. Compost cannot decompose without moisture. It's what the microorganisms need to help break down all the organic material. Okay, so first, let's look on how to compost. First, we just need to select a dry, shady spot near a water source, and it should be an ideal size is like 3 by 3 feet wide and 3 by 3 feet deep and tall. You can just use a bin or chicken wire. There's many different methods we will be expanding on further on in the workshop. Second is to add the brown and green materials in alternate layers. That's something we'll also be going into a bit more specifically as well. And third of all is just, as I mentioned before, keeping the compost pile moist. Again, moisture is one of the key ingredients for breaking down organic matter. Okay, so for any compost pile, there are 3 routine tasks that you need to do when you're about to compost. Step 1 is to chop up all your materials, all your garden materials. If you have a lot of sticks or like a lot of garden waste, like you pulled out some different plants that you needed that you don't need anymore, then what you need to do is you need to clip everything into smaller pieces. And the reason for this is that it increases the surface area that lets the microorganisms break down the materials faster. The more surface area that is made available, the less time it takes them to work through it and break it down into compost. Step 2 is to add and mix browns and greens into the pile, and then aerating the pile by turning it. Browns and greens, as we talked about before, are the carbon-rich materials and the nitrogen-rich materials. Examples of browns would be paper bags, dry landscape, newspaper, fall leaves, sawdust, straw, and green materials would be like things like coffee grinds, fresh landscape waste, fruits, vegetables, tea bags, usually like the more wet materials. Things that you definitely can't add into any compost pile would be things like fish or meat, bones, dairy, diseased plants. They're just things that could either contaminate your pile or just won't break down properly, especially or at least in a small backyard style compost system. Here we have an example of what your outdoor compost bin should look like. And basically you would start with a bare ground. So it shouldn't be on top of any kind of like vegetation or anything. And on the bin, at the very bottom of the bin, if you start with empty bin, you'll start with some of the coarser materials, so things like sticks. And then you would want to repeatedly layer like browns and greens. And as you can see in the example on the right-hand side, yes, and also be careful not to pack the materials close together. You want them to be loose so that the air and moisture can get through. Yes. And then next would be to turn the compost pile. That is something that should be done every 2 weeks, at least every 2 weeks, as well as each time you add more material, the compost pile should be turned. And basically what this means is when you take your pitchfork or your shovel, and as you can see, you removing the outer layer of the pile, putting it to a side, and then putting the inner layer on the outside of the new pile. And this way, it helps aerate and bring oxygen into the pile, which helps heat it up and speeds up the breakdown process. Uh, by turning the compost, you're adding oxygen, which is necessary for the microorganisms to continue to break down the material. Next, we have the last step of maintaining air and water balance. So this is something that also should be done at least every 2 weeks. Or just in general, you just, as a part of maintaining your pile, you need to constantly hose and water your compost pile to make sure that it feels as wet as a wrung out sponge. So you don't want it to be too wet, like you don't want it to be sopping wet, but at the same time, a dry pile just will not decompose. So when you want to, if you were to poke it, you want to feel like it was a sponge that was just wrung out. It's important to remember that compost piles need to be watered just like a plant does. In order for a plant pile to successfully break down and produce compost, it must be moist. It can't neither muddy or dry. Okay, so after all these different steps, you should be getting dark, crumbly, sweet-smelling organic material, and it shouldn't have any remnants of your food or waste. Depending on the method that you use, it would be common for certain materials like sticks to remain, but that's perfectly fine and can be used as mulch. Okay, so we're going to be looking at 3 composting methods. There's many different kinds of composting systems, which could be things like the 3-bin system, a tumbler. There's different kinds of bins. You don't even have to necessarily use a bin, but those are different kind of systems. There are 3 main kind of categories that they fall under, those particular methods, and these are cold passive compost, hot active compost, and vermicomposting. So cold passive compost, this is the one that we suggest to implement at your school gardens, because otherwise, our school gardens typically don't generate enough waste to build a pile that's big enough to make a proper hot active compost pile, which we'll get into a bit more later. But generally, a cold passive compost system is just one that is gathered and left to decompose naturally. So because of that, it takes about 12 to 18 months to produce usable compost, and weeds and diseased plants can't be put in, otherwise it will contaminate your compost, so you won't be able to really use it in your garden to fertilize your plants, but also because the seeds won't be killed by heat, because a cold passive compost pile won't generate enough heat to kill off seeds or disease. However, this pile still needs to be kept moist, regularly watered. It's a cold passive compost pile is not the same as just putting a bunch of waste in a pile somewhere, because even if it's in a pile, if it's not kept moist, it's not decomposing. So it's not a cold passive compost pile. It still is a decomposing pile. It's not just a pile of dead leaves and things left somewhere. So this is something that it should be also covered in a tarp, regularly hosed and watered, and also regularly turned for aeration as well, so in order to speed up the process. This is ideal for an add-as-you-go sort of pile, so you don't really have to think about it too much, and you can just gather material into the pile throughout the year. Whenever you do have some organic materials on hand, you can just add it when you need to. Typically, a lot less compost is produced from this method, and a lot of the sticks and twigs are left over, and it produces a coarser compost. Here we have a hot active compost. This is typically used in composting batches. So usually you will collect the different kinds of composting materials over some time, and then you put them all in a pile together at once to it's not something that you should really add to it over time. It definitely produces a lot more compost in a lot less time, usually about 3 to 6 months, but it requires a very large pile of material at one time in order for the core of the pile to heat up enough. So it needs to be at least 1.5 meters minimum, which is why we don't necessarily suggest using this method, even though it is a quite effective way of producing compost. The heat also will kill off the various weed seeds and disease plants, so it lets you put in a lot more materials there's a lot less restrictions for cold compost. And as you can see in this diagram, cold compost, even if you have the same amount of starting material, you'll end up with a lot less compost volume produced at the end of the process. Whereas for hot composting, you'll have about the same amount of volume of material as compost as you had as the original organic material. And it'll also produce a much finer compost. Vermicomposting is the third main method, and this is also known as worm composting. It's the natural process of worms eating scraps. This is a very fantastic natural process that produces high quality compost with many beneficial microbes, which would typically get killed off in hot composting method because of the heat. And we'll be going a lot more into this in the how to build your own worm bin session near the end of this workshop. Okay, so now the green-brown carbon to nitrogen ratio is a topic that is very important to composting, but it can be a bit complicated. But basically, what it is that the microorganisms required for composting, they have a balanced diet. So they need to digest organic material that are about 30 parts of carbon for every part of nitrogen that they consume. So if they have too much nitrogen, this is what causes smelly compost. Compost, if it's done correctly, should actually be very sweet smelling. However, what happens is that there's too much nitrogen put into the pile. The microorganisms can't use all that nitrogen, and the excess is lost in the form of smelly ammonia gas. So, for the best performance, the compost pile, or more specifically, the composting microorganisms, require the correct proportion of carbon for energy and nitrogen for protein production. So, using the carbon to nitrogen ratio, scientists have determined that the fastest way to produce fertile, sweet-smelling compost is to maintain a carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 25 to 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. So for a hot, fast compost pile, which would generate heat up to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, the ideal ratio of materials is 30 to 1. For a cold passive compost, a ratio of 50 to 1 is adequate. And basically what that means is that a cold passive pile, it would be perfectly fine for that pile to have more browns, such as hay, paper, sticks, dried leaves, than in a hot compost pile. So more carbon to nitrogen. So it is possible to have too much carbon. Basically what would happen in that case is that the whole process would just be slowed down even more. And here you can see a diagram kind of outlining the process. of the various raw materials and water, with the oxygen going through the pile and the evaporating through it, and the water also evaporating, and which is helping generate heat and create the finished compost. Okay, so the ideal ratio, in order to get that ideal ratio of 30-1 or 50-1, or somewhere in between, you can obtain it by adding 2 parts of a green material to 1 part of a brown material to your bin. And a part just generally means a certain quantity of a material, such as you can have like having 2 5-gallon buckets of green and 1 packed bucket of brown. So for most fresh plant material contains about 40% carbon. So the carbon to nitrogen ratio varies because of differences in nitrogen content, not carbon content, because all of it has both carbon and nitrogen. It's just about the actual ratio. So as we can see in this diagram, green, what is considered green, material that's considered green, is one where the difference of the ratio is 30-1 or less. So 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen or less. Whereas if it's brown, then it's more than 30. So if you, like, for example, as you can see for leaves, they're typically 60 to 80 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. And so you can see a quick comparison of green materials versus carbon materials, and it gives you an outline of the various ratios that exist, what makes one carbon, one nitrogen rich. And this is a very handy chart, as you can see. We'll be providing on our site later that you can look back at for reference as well. So tips to remember for maintaining the ideal ratio for greens to browns is to have 2 parts green to 1 part brown for when you're creating a batch pile. So when you're creating a hot active compost, this will result in about a 30-1 CN ratio. It won't be perfect, but it will get you what you're aiming for. A 1-to-1 ratio works just as well for an add-as-you-go pile, so for a cold passive compost. So if you just add as much green as you add brown materials, then that is perfectly fine. And that will just be adequate enough to create a warm pile, so there will be some heat, so it can still decompose. So now it's question and answers time. If there's any questions about what I just talked about for greens and brown ratios, that is a topic that there's a lot of debate about, and is very important when it comes to composting. You can just put it in the chat box, and me or one of the moderators will address it. Okay, it seems like we don't have any questions at the time. We're always happy to answer questions, though. If you think of any in the future, just email one of us at Healthy Planet, and we'll get right back to you. Okay, then moving on to the one bin as-you-go compost system. And here you can see various examples of different kinds of bins you can use for a cold passive system. And this is what we would suggest for our school gardens, because it gives you a place to neatly put all your different garden waste materials away. It doesn't necessarily generate compost very quickly, but it can and will over time. It really, though, is just good for having a neat place to put away your materials, and it doesn't look messy or bad in your garden, and also protects your compost pile from vermin or other pests. So we're going to be talking about how to make your own add as you go compost system. Okay, so there's several basic supplies that are needed. One is obviously the bin itself. This is something that should be placed on soil or unused grassy area. The reason for this is because you want air to be able to go through from the bottom of the pile, in order to so you want it to pass through to help aerate and help the decomposition process. And also, compost piles often produce leaching, which is the liquid that comes out from the compost pile, and that's not something that you would want on an artificial surface such as like concrete or asphalt, or if you were to like put it on a deck or something, because it would damage the surface. That's why it's usually best, if you can, to place it on soil. You would also need a garden hose with a spray nozzle for watering down your compost piles, and also a shovel or a pitchfork for turning, clippers, and a scraps pail or like a 4 to 5 gallon bucket. And another supply that you could definitely use, but is not necessary, is a compost activator. And this is a high nitrogen source, and so this could be anything from like coffee grinds or bone meal or enzymes. This just helps your compost pile jumpstart. It's definitely useful for a first-time pile, but it's not necessary. Okay, so for your one bin compost pile, you have 4 steps to maintain it. And first, you chop and moisten your materials, and placing about 3 inches of the coarse materials, such as twigs and straws, on the bottom for drainage and ventilation. And then, as we mentioned before, you layer the greens and brown materials. It's up to you. There's no real perfect method of doing that. It's just up to your discretion and depending on what kind of materials that you have available. And then step 2 is just to continue to build the pile as more things become available. And it's also important to remember every time that you add to the pile that you turn it and aerate it, and then you water it. Step 3 is the optional use of activators whenever you're adding new scraps. This will definitely help you speed up the whole decomposition process. So it would be able to get a produced compost in a much shorter period of time if you were to use it. Step 4 is just to make sure to turn your pile weekly and keep the pile moist. We generally suggest at least watering it every 2 weeks, or at least like keeping an eye on it and touching it and making sure that it has the consistency of a wet wrung out sponge. And when it doesn't, just to add to it then. And ideally, what you would get is a finished compost that is dark brown, black, crumbly, and has a rich, earthy smell, as you can see in the example. That's what it should look like. And generally, as I mentioned before, finished passive cold compost would typically have a coarser and like a larger pieces like sticks and twigs left over, because of that process won't be able to break down to large materials that quickly or thoroughly. After you've created your compost, there's more than one way that you can use it. The main way is as a soil amendment. So what you would do is just dig 2 to 4 inches deep into the ground amongst your plants in the garden, and you fill that space and mix in compost with your soil. Another thing you could do is to apply half to 3 inches of finished compost and just mix it into the top 4 inches of your soil about 1 month before planting, just to help prepare it and so that it has all the nutrients needed to get a good start to your planting season. Also, you could just use it as mulch as well. So for as you can see in the picture on the right, you're just putting it as a ring around your tree. You create these raised ridges and like sort of an inside well so that it can still be watered right at the base of the tree, and it will help get all the nutrients to the roots as well. And lastly, you can make a compost tea, and basically what this is a liquid fertilizer that you can create just by and there's various methods that you can use, but mainly you just take like a gallon of water and like a shovel full of compost. You put it in and you soak it in there, and the resulting liquid you can use just as a liquid fertilizer you can spray on your plants, and that is definitely recommended by a lot of farmers and gardeners as a way of really increasing the bounty that you get during harvest time. Okay, so we have question and answer period again. If you have any questions about the cold passive compost system, just type it in the comment section, and I'll be able to answer you. And if you come up with any questions later on, just feel free to email us. Okay, it seems like we don't have any questions right now. But again, as I said it before, you can just anytime you have any questions, we'd be happy to help out. Especially with this compost system, which is something that can be a bit overwhelming or confusing at times, but is really something that's easy and is a great tool for us to use in the garden. Okay, so now we'll look at vermicomposting. This is also known as worm composting. And this is a really great method that not only it produces really highly nutritious compost, but also is a great teaching tool as a way for kids to be able to see as a way of seeing organic material decomposed in front of their eyes, and like actually see the whole process of the life cycle from the very beginning to the very end, and about like seeing how that material gets returned back into the ground to help new plants grow. And also kids love worms. So for the worm bin, typically we use red wigglers instead of earthworms, and they can consume the organic materials and produce castings, which are what we actually use for fertilizer. And as a result, we don't really need to use soil for bedding. Just having like shredded paper is perfectly good for any worm bin. And so a worm bin actually is usually not that messy. It's can be quite easy to take care of. So composting with worms takes about 4 to 6 months, and it can only use a limited amount of materials because you don't want to overfeed your worms. You can't just put in everything that you have. You have to make sure that it's enough for your worms, also not too much for your worms. Okay, so maintenance of a worm bin is not too difficult. You just have to keep it in a dark, cool, or shaded area. You add dry bedding, such as shredded newspaper or cardboard, whenever the worms are fed organic materials, such as plant scraps or food scraps. It's important, though, to not add citrus, bones, meat, grease, or plastic, or any inorganic things as well, simply because your worms will either get them sick or they just will not be able to they will not be able to consume them, and it's doing things like that makes is what causes smelly or disgusting compost. Otherwise, they don't produce a bad smell at all. It's usually a very clean and simple process. Okay, so there's numerous configurations of worm bins, but we'll be looking at just the two main ones the first is the non-continuous, and this is just a single bin and no layers. You can use some. You can buy one, but you can also just make one with a simple Rubbermaid bin that you just punch holes into it for ventilation. In the picture I have here is just one simple bin, and it's on top of another bin, but that is not another layer. That's just like a tray to collect the liquid that leaches out from the compost. So a continuous vertical flow system. What happens here is when you have multiple bins that are stacked on top of each other with holes on the bottom of the top bins. And what this does is it allows worms, once finished composting at a lower level, to migrate upwards towards new food. So um, as you can see here, you just put a new bin on top with all the fresh new food waste or organic materials and bedding material. And when the worms are finished at the bins below, they'll be attracted to the smells of the food and move upwards, so that you can just take the bottom bins and take the compost out that you can use, and then fill that new empty tray with all your new organic material. And at the very bottom, they have a tray or bin to collect the liquid fertilizer, which you can also just spray onto your plants in the garden. Here we have several resources that we'll also make available on our website. There's like step-by-step instructions for making a worm bin, as well as more information on how to troubleshoot worm bins and various teaching materials that you can get for it. This is something that's very popular, and there's a lot of resources out there for setting up worm bins and to provide inexpensive materials for them within the classroom. So yes, we will make these links available for you at the website if you're interested. There you go. And now we have the last question answer period. If you have any questions about what we just talked about or what we talked about earlier, this is a great time to ask, and just put them in the chat box. Okay, it seems like we don't have any questions right now. But again, all of this material will be all this material that we talked about and all the links that we provided, as well as just the content for this presentation, will be all made available on our website. So, and this presentation itself. So feel free to, if you have any other questions that we didn't address, feel free to just send us an email. And also the recordings for all our presentations and workshops, all of this one as well as the previous one, will all be made available on the Healthy Planet YouTube channel. So thank you for attending. I hope you have a great day.